did you say?
I said you're not my mother!
I am your mother! That line, raw, unfiltered, chilling, is a perfect entry into what we're talking about today. Why does horror find motherhood such fertile ground for fear? Why is it so unsettling to see mothers pushed to their breaking points?
These are some of the questions we want to dive into today. Hi, I'm Ben.
And I'm Ellie, and welcome to our discussion on motherhood and horror. Horror is much deeper than what meets the eye. It isn't just about blood, gore, and jump scares. It's a genre that digs deep into cultural anxieties and critiques societal norms, and mothers are not immune.
We chose 7 films to dive into over the course of the quarter. Rosemary's Baby, The Others, We Need to Talk About Kevin, The Babadook, Mother, Hereditary, and Us. Together they span 5 decades of horror, letting us see how the portrayal of motherhood has evolved, or in some cases, remained eerily consistent.
We'll take a look at how these films push back against the idealized image of the mother. What happens when mothers don't or can't live up to these impossible standards? When they resist or even lash out? And why does that terrify us so much?
So here's the plan. We'll start by unpacking the societal expectations placed on mothers and explore the techniques horror uses to amplify those pressures to create fear. Next, we'll dive into how directors bring these stories to life, with specific scene analysis to highlight their approaches. We'll also touch on the presence or absence of fathers and why this is so significant. And finally, we'll wrap up by discussing why these films stick with us long after the credits roll. So let's get into it.
So before we dive into how motherhood is portrayed in horror cinema, let's start off by defining what exactly we mean by the idealized image of the mother. In our society, the quote-unquote perfect mother is one who is nurturing, patient, self-sacrificing, the list goes on. She fulfills all of these roles without complaint, even if they come at a great personal cost to her.
This is a perception that traditional gender roles have instilled in us over time. Historically, a woman's place was in the home, supporting husbands and raising children. Our film selection starts in the 60s, where this perception was a reality.
For women in the 60s, autonomy and choice was a very real issue. Rosemary's Baby takes these fears and amplifies them. Rosemary has her bodily autonomy stripped away by everyone around her, her neighbors, her doctors, even her husband. In the movie, her pregnancy becomes this broader metaphor for societal control over women's bodies.
And by the 2000s, the dominant period of our viewing list, we saw that these societal roles had shifted. For example, we see the working mother, like Amelia in The Babadook, face what sociologist Arlie Hochschild calls the second shift. Mothers are expected to do the unpaid labor of caregiving and cleaning, even if they're exhausted from a full day's work.
We see Amelia struggle to balance her grief and her work, all while acting as a single parent to her difficult child, Samuel. He's a handful and he demands a lot from his mother. There's this expectation that Amelia needs to balance everything without breaking, but the horror in this film stems from how Amelia grows more and more isolated and overwhelmed by the compounding demands placed on her.
Right, and in movies released more recently, like Hereditary, depictions of mental illness appear as conversations about mental health grow more frequent. Annie struggles with her unresolved trauma and guilt stemming from her and her mother's relationship, but at the end of the day, she is expected to suppress these struggles to keep her family together.
Even as decades pass and the role of mothers shifts, these expectations are unrelenting. Whether it's the selfless housewife of Rosemary's Baby or the multitasking, grieving mother of The Babadook, the burden remains and the horror critiques it all the same.
Now let's take a look at some of the specific techniques horror films use to create fear in their audiences. Horror has a way of turning the ordinary into something terrifying, and it is no different when it comes to motherhood. These stories do not invent fear, but instead they extract it from the real and amplify it. In watching these films, Ellie and I noticed 4 key themes that kept emerging: isolation, sacrifice, supernatural symbolism, and duality. And I think they compound on each other in an interesting way. Let's start with isolation. In these films, isolation creates a space that horror can fill. The mothers are often cut off physically, emotionally, or both. They are trapped within the confines of their responsibilities, disconnecting them from support and really forcing them to endure everything alone.
Right. Take The Babadook. Amelia is entirely alone, trapped by the grief of her husband's death. Her dimly lit, unkempt home acts as a constant reminder that she's isolated, and her son only further alienates her from her community.
Exactly. That alienation makes her vulnerable to the impending supernatural terror of The Babadook. This film takes something as universal as loneliness and really amplifies it.
Once isolated, the mothers in these films are rendered more vulnerable to exploitative forces, and they are pushed to sacrifice everything. I think Darren Aronofsky's Mother is a perfect example of this. Mother is isolated from society at large and spends the majority of her time alone in her home. When violent mobs infiltrate her home, she more easily falls victim to their demands for sacrifice, culminating in the involuntary sacrifice of her child. These depictions force audiences to confront an unsettling truth. Society inadvertently views maternal sacrifice as necessary, regardless of the cost.
Once these mothers are isolated and have nothing left to give, they become fertile ground for the supernatural. These films externalize invisible struggles, turning emotions like grief, guilt, and rage into physical threats.
The monster in the Babadook is the manifestation of Amelia's grief for her husband and frustration with raising an atypical child. It forces her to confront the emotions she's been taught to suppress. It makes the intangible visible. Grief becomes a clawed creature, guilt a lurking shadow. And what's really fascinating is how these emotions don't just stay internal. They seep into the spaces these mothers occupy. Domestic spaces, which should be sanctuaries, become battlegrounds.
Exactly. Carol Clover captures this perfectly with her concept of the terrible place. She writes, "The house or tunnel may at first seem a safe haven, but the same walls that promise to keep the killer out quickly become the walls that hold the victim in." This idea comes alive in The Others. Grace's mansion, shrouded in perpetual fog, is both a physical and symbolic barrier to the outside world. The house's dim interiors and suffocating routines reflect her isolation, while its ghostly presence conspire against her.
So now we come to duality. This, I think, is where everything we've discussed, being isolated, drained by sacrifice, and trapped in unsafe spaces, really comes together. Now that these mothers are pushed to their extremes, they're no longer able to conform to societal expectations. They have to exist in duality.
Right. It's like horror strips away the facade of the perfect mother and forces us to confront the contradictions at the heart of motherhood. These characters become both saviors and threats. They nurture but also destroy. Their love is inseparable from their rage. And this duality makes them not just terrifying, but interestingly, I think it makes them deeply human. It's unsettling because it's so brutally honest.
That's why Red in Us is such a compelling figure. She's not just a shadowy villain. She's the part of Adelaide that's been buried. She's the part that's had to fight for survival. I think her existence forces Adelaide to face her own guilt and the sacrifices she's made to protect her family. It's a confrontation between the two sides of the same person.
Exactly. Horror leans into that contradiction, asking whether a mother can protect her family and still hold on to herself. Can she meet impossible expectations without being consumed by them?
Now that we've unpacked some of the techniques horror films use to generate fear, let's talk about how a director's perspective shapes these stories, especially when it comes to mothers. One quote that stuck with me during this project was from Eleanor Louis, the founder of the Final Girls Berlin Horror Festival. "Women have the knowledge of being women and are in a way more daring to show women in ways that are unlikable." I found the idea of showing unlikable women particularly interesting. It made me wonder, how do male and female directors approach motherhood differently? And how does that affect how we experience the horror?
Is there anything that stood out to you most when comparing male and female directors?
The biggest difference was how they handled the mothers themselves. In The Babadook by Jennifer Kent and We Need to Talk About Kevin by Lynne Ramsay, the two films directed by women, the mothers aren't softened or likable. They're raw, messy, and deeply human. Take Amelia in The Babadook. Kent doesn't shy away from her anger, exhaustion, or moments of cruelty towards her son. She's unfiltered and flawed, which makes her uncomfortably relatable.
Right, Kent is completely flipping the societal expectations we have for mothers. Do you think this willingness to make her so unlikable at times changes how we perceive her as a character?
Absolutely. We're so used to seeing mothers as patient and loving that when Amelia snaps, it's pretty jarring. But that's the point. Kent forces us to sit with that discomfort and empathize with her rather than judge her. We see a similar thing in We Need to Talk About Kevin. Eva is resentful, disconnected from her son, and struggles with guilt. Ramsay challenges the idea of unconditional maternal love and explores how damaging these expectations really can be for women. The bottom line here is that these portrayals are deeply intimate. It's possible that female directors bring lived experience to their films. Both Kent and Ramsay are mothers, and that authenticity comes through. They're able to capture the realities of motherhood, the good, the bad, and the ugly, in ways that feel intimate and honest.
So we have a sense of what female directors bring to the table. How do you feel male directors differ in their portrayal of mothers?
I would say that the male-directed films we watched leaned more on external forces to drive the horror. The mothers weren't inherently flawed. Instead, they were placed in circumstances that made them vulnerable, even villainous, through no fault of their own.
What do you mean by external forces?
Right, we can look at some examples. Take Mother by Darren Aronofsky. The mother is not a flawed character, but rather a symbol of sacrifice and societal exploitation. The horror in this movie stems from external events, the crowd invading her home, taking her child, consuming her identity. Aronofsky externalizes the conflict, making it about societal greed rather than her internal struggles. We see this in Rosemary's Baby too. Polanski's Rosemary is, by definition, a good mother. She endures physical and emotional pain for the sake of her child. Again, the horror here is external. It's the satanic cult, the medical system, rather than an internal conflict. Rosemary isn't flawed, she's victimized.
This trend you're pointing out definitely makes sense, but what about Annie in Hereditary? She's a very nuanced character with internal struggles. Doesn't that challenge the idea that male directors primarily lean on external forces?
That's a great point, and this distinction is by no means a binary. Ari Aster gives Annie a lot of emotional complexity. Her guilt, trauma, and resentment are central to the film. But these internal conflicts are deeply intertwined with the external supernatural, like the demonic cult. So while Annie is indeed an emotionally complex character, much of her experience in the film is framed by these external catalysts. I think that's the key distinction here. Male directors often use external forces as the driving mechanism, even when they craft rich, complex characters. In contrast, female directors focus almost entirely on the internal.
So, what do you think these differences in approach really mean? Why do you think female directors lean into this raw, intimate portrayal of motherhood, while male directors externalize the conflict?
I think it reflects what they want the audience to take away. Female directors like Ramsay and Kent want us to question ourselves more deeply. They make us reflect on our expectations of mothers and even our own complicity in these expectations. Male directors, by externalizing the conflict, keep us at a safer emotional distance. It's easier to analyze these films without implicating ourselves in the same way. This distance by no means makes the stories less impactful, but it does shape how we empathize with maternal figures on screen and to what degree we extend this empathy to mothers off screen. So what does this all look like in practice? To fully understand how horror deconstructs the social expectations of motherhood, we need to take a closer look at a few key scenes from these films.
Exactly. Let's start with Babadook, a film that portrays grief and maternal exhaustion through psychological and supernatural horror.
I need to sleep.
I'm sorry, Mommy. I was just really hungry.
If you're that hungry, why don't you go and eat shit?
This scene is a pivotal moment in The Babadook. It is the first time we see Amelia truly break and lash out at her son. Kent constructs this moment in such a way that forces us to sit with a mother at her breaking point. The muted, gray-blue tones dominate the scene, reflecting Amelia's emotional desolation, bleak, cold, entirely devoid of warmth and comfort. This desaturation mirrors the absence of emotional connection in her relationship with her son Samuel. The death staging here emphasizes this further. Amelia is sharply in focus in the foreground, while Samuel is blurred in the background. This subtle visual cue not only highlights their emotional distance, but also reflects how, in this moment, Samuel becomes indistinguishable from the broader chaos and demands in Amelia's life. The blurring dehumanizes him, reducing him to yet another burden rather than her child.
And then there's the outburst itself. It's severe and abrupt, in stark contrast with Samuel's soft and almost timid "I'm hungry." It strictly violates expectations of maternal patience and nurturing that we would expect from a mother in this situation. That violation makes us, as the audience, really uncomfortable and confused. What's really interesting in this film is that there's a degree of ambiguity as to when exactly Amelia is possessed by the Babadook. This scene becomes even more layered when we consider Barbara Creed's idea that possession becomes the excuse for legitimizing a display of aberrant feminine behavior. Under the guise of possession, Amelia is allowed to snap at her child and defy what is typically expected of her. But is it really possession, or is it something much more human?
I totally agree that ambiguity is so central to the film. If Amelia isn't possessed, the horror becomes even more unsettling because it asks us to face the idea that her monstrosity in this moment is just her natural human response to relentless grief, isolation, and pressure. And that's what makes Kent's approach so powerful. This film does not give us easy answers. It blurs the line between the monstrous and the human, forcing us to question how much of Amelia's behavior is defined by the supernatural, and how much of it comes from the weight of her internal struggles. It is a critique of how society demands mothers to suppress their negative feelings for the sake of those around them, leaving them to deal with these emotions alone.
It's a really powerful idea. Now let's take a look at a key scene from Mother, a film that takes a completely different approach, using allegories to explore societal pressures and exploitation of mothers.
Where is he?
Darren Aronofsky's Mother builds to its most devastating moment in the scene where the protagonist's newborn is taken and killed by the crowd. The handheld camera stays tight on Mother, capturing her mounting panic as the chaotic mob closes in around her. The flickering light and erratic shadows make everything feel unstable, like the world is collapsing in on itself. The contrast between the baby, glowing and angelic, and the mob's dim, sickly appearance amplifies the horror of innocence being destroyed.
And the sound design is just as haunting. The overwhelming noise of the mob crescendos, then cuts to a deafening silence when the baby's cries stop. That eerie crunch that follows, it forces you to sit in horror. Spadoni describes atmosphere as something that fills the space, suffocating the viewer, and this scene does exactly that. You're trapped in her panic and grief. This abrupt quiet forces the audience to confront the atrocity in its rawest form.
The chaos Aronofsky creates through erratic camera work and oppressive soundscape makes this exploitation visceral. It's not just something you watch, it's something you feel.
So we spent a lot of time talking about the pressures mothers face in these films. But what about the fathers? How do they factor into these dynamics?
Fathers play a crucial role, but not in a positive way. They typically fall into 3 archetypes: absent, ineffective, or harmful. And in every case, their actions, or lack thereof, amplify the burdens on mothers.
Let's start with the absent fathers. What makes their absence so impactful?
Absent fathers leave mothers completely isolated. In the Babadook, Amelia's husband is dead, but his absence is palpable. She's left alone to manage her grief and raise a difficult child with no emotional or practical support. Similarly, in the others, Grace's husband is physically absent, leaving her trapped in the mansion with 2 children who have extreme needs. Without a partner to share the load, the weight of caregiving becomes overwhelming, deepening her isolation.
And what about when the father is present but ineffective?
This is where it gets interesting. Ineffective fathers are physically there, but they fail to step up. In Hereditary, Steve is passive and dismissive. He's not a partner to Annie. He's just a bystander, leaving her to shoulder all the emotional labor of managing their family. Another example is Gabe in Us. He's not malicious, but he's unhelpful. His inability to lead forces Adelaide to take on both protector and nurturer roles, compounding the pressure on her.
And the third archetype?
The harmful father. This is the most destructive archetype. In Mother, Javier Bardem's character doesn't just fail to support Mother, he actively causes her suffering. He invites chaos into their home and sacrifices their child for his own gain. Similarly, in Rosemary's Baby, Guy betrays Rosemary to further his career, aligning with the cult and completely disregarding her autonomy.
So, in those cases, the father isn't just absent or ineffective. They're actively contributing to the mother's suffering.
Exactly. Regardless of the archetype, the father's failure, whether through absence, passivity, or harm, forces the mother to take on impossible dual roles as both protector and nurturer. It's a recurring theme in horror that highlights just how much these films amplify the pressures and expectations placed on mothers.
So, as we wrap up, let's discuss why these films scare us so much. For me, what makes these films so haunting is how they implicate us as viewers. They don't just show mothers breaking under pressure, they make us feel complicit. In The Babadook, for example, we're witnesses to Amelia's unraveling, forced to question whether we've contributed to similar pain in the lives of our own mothers. It's deeply personal, and that's what lingers with me.
While I understand your point, what resonates more with me is how these films shatter the comforting norms of motherhood. They strip away the idealized image of mothers as endlessly nurturing and reveal the raw, contradictory reality. In Hereditary, Annie's role as both protector and threat exposes the impossible standards placed on mothers and forces us to confront the tension between selflessness and survival. That contradiction hits harder for me.
And I think our different takes are a testament to how horror works. These films resonate in so many ways because they draw from universal fears but make them deeply personal. Whether it's complicity, shattered norms, or something else entirely, they force you to reflect on your own experiences and the society around you. Horror like this proves it's more than entertainment. It's a mirror that reflects back our deepest anxieties.